Hello and good evening to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, our program is called Road to Inauguration. My name is Pastor Novella Smith, and I am the Associate Pastor at the Metropolitan Adventist Church in Hyattsville, Maryland. The Road to Inauguration is a program where we will look into three main subjects. One of those subjects being Generation Z and how they are coping with the images that they have been seeing for the past 4 years in particular. We will also deal with races and why Blacks and whites view things differently that happen in politics. And then we will also look into explaining some political history and explaining the Trump presidency a bit more in depth. Today, we are honored to have our host as Mr. Richard Cunningham. Mr. Richard Cunningham is a journalist and a digital storyteller of Trinidadian descent based in the greater DC metropolitan area. He currently works as an associate producer for the Kojo Namdi Show, a popular local news radio show airing on weekdays on WAMU 88.5, Washington, D.C.'s NPR member station. He graduated from University of Maryland, Baltimore County in December 2019 with a BA in Media and Communication Studies. He is currently studying online at the University of Missouri to obtain his MA in journalism, specializing in interactive media. We thank Mr. Richard Cunningham for being our host. Our panelists include Dr. Aza Alsop. Aza is a first-generation American who grew up in Trinidad before living in a number of different states on the East Coast. He studied biology, philosophy, and jazz studies at North Carolina Central University before carrying out social neuroscience research training in the Thai lab at MIT as a part of the Harvard Medical School MIT MD PhD program. He studies how social information is computed, integrated, and biased in the brain and the resulting impact on cognition and behavior. He also studies the mechanisms by which music and mindfulness modulate social connections and stress management. His research is guided by the belief that deconstructing these mechanisms will provide a better understanding of how social groups function and offer critical insight into enhancing and developing and functioning a society at large. Aza is a multi-instrumentalist who is deeply rooted in the experience of music from the African diaspora. He engaged in formal studies of gospel and jazz music in college, and as a PhD student was awarded MIT's Immersion Scholarship to study at Berklee College of Music and has released multiple projects of his original music. He teaches music and mindfulness as tools to help enhance empathy, social justice, health equality, and wellness. To that end, he co-founded Renaissance Entertainment LLC, a company that operates at the intersection of music, science, and community building to promote a culture of wellness. He does research and provides clinical care as a resident in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University. Dr. Alsop, we thank you. Dr. Herman Percy. Dr. Herman Percy, born in Kingston, Jamaica, is a journalist and political science professor. She also was a campaign manager for the Volusia County, Florida Supervisor of Elections race and a campaign strategist for the 2016 Maryland 4th Congressional District race, and worked on 2 presidential campaigns and 3 Democratic National Conventions. Dr. Percy has also organized and moderated 2 local election debates, the Anne Arundel County Executive and Annapolis Mayoral Candidates debates. As a journalist, she has hosted 6 political talk shows with Maryland state and local lawmakers, and was most recently with C-SPAN Network reporting from the White House and news anchor with WTOP Radio News. Dr. Percy also serves as news director, producer, and news anchor for Wheel of Fortune's Pat Sajak's radio station in Annapolis. She's presently a TV and radio political commentator for local, national, and international media, and has written newspaper columns on presidential campaigns and elections for the Baltimore Sun and the Orlando Centennial, and is the author of 3 publications, including an American Government College home study course. And lastly, her most recent book is Will Your Vote Count? Fixing America's Broken Electoral System. Dr. Percy, we thank you and welcome. Lastly, we have Lillian Shepherd Esquire. Lillian Shepherd was born in Guyana, South America, and migrated to the United States in 1979. She's a product of DC Public Schools and Tacoma Academy. After high school, she moved to Worcester, Massachusetts. She attended and graduated from Worcester State College in 1991. She moved to Brooklyn, New York, and attended and graduated from Brooklyn Law School in 1996. After law school, Ms. Shepherd worked for the Kings County District Attorney's Office from 1996 to 2002. She returned to Washington, D.C., where she was a real estate settlement attorney and practiced family law. She returned to being a prosecutor and subsequently a hearing examiner with the Department of Motor Vehicle. We would like to welcome Attorney Shepherd and all of our panelists, as well as our host today. Mr. Cunningham, thank you so much for being here. And we now turn it over to you, Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you so much, Novella. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today on Martin Luther King Day. But you have our 3 segments today are highlighted first by Dr. Azia Alsop, which is helping Gen Z the differences in perspectives when it comes to politics between African Americans and white people. And then finally, we're going to talk to attorney Lillian Shepherd about explaining the political division with history in our country. And then she's going to talk to us a little bit about impeachment. First off, I want to start off with Dr. Alsop. I hear you have some opening remarks. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of be in this space and, share my thoughts and have this conversation. Growing up, as a Seventh-day Adventist, growing up in Metro, it's nice to be back and share in community. I think I don't have a lot to say in terms of opening remarks, but I think I do want to share some things that kind of shed light on the perspective I take when I look at the country, when I look at the social dynamics, when I think about trauma. And a lot of that is guided by sort of looking at the way that we behave as humans, as being very much grounded in our biology, right? And how does the brain work? How does the brain take signals and then use those signals, integrate in some way based on previous memories, learning experiences to then drive behavior in a certain way? And how are those things shaped not only, in our lives, but just in biological systems? And so a lot of what I was doing in graduate school was looking at social information processing particularly. And one of the experiments that we did, I think, speak directly to this idea of the images that we're seeing and how trauma exists in the communities of people of African descent, is that if I take a mouse and I train that mouse that every time some cue comes on, it could be like a light or a sound, it'll get shocked, right? I can teach that mouse. Really, I could teach a fly, I could teach a worm, any animal really that has a nervous system. I can teach them, if I give you some cue and then I associate it with some negative outcome, that you should be afraid of it and you should avoid whatever it was that cue represents, right? What's interesting is that you can do that with one animal. What I did in graduate school was to show that if you have another animal that's observing this, the animal that's observing will learn this. And this is, there are different circuits that are responsible for this, right? So this idea of sort of observational fear and observational trauma, I think, speak directly to this. But I think it's important to understand that there's a biology that is innate and that is a part of how we process things that this system kind of takes advantage of to keep us in this sort of traumatic space. And I think that is exactly what we see when we see, images of young Black men and women being killed by the police. When we see images like nooses and the Confederate flag, these are all cues. And if you think about the legacy and history, these cues have a very deeply entrenched emotional significance of fear. And so it's not accidental that the system at large uses these cues and widely distributes them to keep us in this state of fear and to sort of activate generational trauma. I think that's something that we sometimes take for granted, is the effects of previous generational trauma and how we actually experience our lived experience. Just to give another sort of just anecdote about how this looks in a biological system, you can take a mouse, again, we would consider a very basic sort of, animal, not nearly as intelligent as we are. And you can train a parent mouse to fear certain odors. So you play a cue, again, that's a specific odor, and then you give it some negative outcome. You can then show that the offspring who've never been exposed to that cue will not only fear that cue, but the part of the brain that responds to that cue is actually enhanced in the offspring who've never experienced it. Right. And so this idea of generational trauma and how it impacts us today, there are things that we've never experienced, in our generation, or even the generation below us, Gen Z. Those cues still evoke powerful emotions, and no one's necessarily talking about it. Therapy is not something that is kind of widely espoused or widely, done in the Black community, in communities of African descent. I mean, for all of us are coming from on a panel are coming from West Indian backgrounds. There's so much trauma, and even the generation before me, that just is never discussed, right? But those things still actually live in the next generation. So I think that's sort of the framework that I want to lay in terms of really thinking about how this biology is driving us, and how it seems that we keep in this cycle, right, where every couple, let's say every decade or so, we're back at this question of like, what is our equality in this country? How much of a human is a Black person really in this country, right? And what is the thing that, even though we say that, this is not what we want to be free, we want to break through this, somehow we keep trapped in this cycle, right? And starting to think about the biology and how the system uses the biology to keep us trapped. And so that's kind of the framework by which I approach this. And I think also using that framework, we can start to begin to think about like what the solutions might be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alsop. I have a couple of questions for you, because you're mentioning race a lot, and I'm just concerned. I'm just wondering, are there any other concerns that you've been hearing from young people that cause them this trauma or this feeling of fear, anxiety at this time?
Yeah, I mean, look, the rates of suicidality and suicide behavior are rising, right? Mm-hmm. In general, kind of across the board, but particularly concerning in young people of African descent. There are levels that they weren't seen at previously. Yeah. And I mean, when I'm in the hospital, I'm seeing children like 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds who don't want to be here and are actively trying to end their life. I think race, obviously, and racial trauma is one aspect of that.
Yeah.
But I think the younger generation looks around, they see a world in turmoil. They see an environment that we're not taking care of. Any child with a phone can go on Google and see what the projections are for global warming and how much time we have left on the planet, right? And when they look around, they don't see the older generation having anything different, right? And so I think particularly in the context of the Obama presidency, where especially younger children grew up with the idea of, a Black president, that's actually, for some people, they know more of a Black president than anything else, if they were on sort of the tail end of Bush. And so I think to then go from that idea and that ideal and some of the ideas that were being talked about to then follow that up with Trump presidency, especially if, they aren't really well versed about the history of the country and really hadn't had to experience that sort of those sort of cues before because of sort of the last, let's say 8 to 12 years. I think it's really traumatic. And then you talk about COVID-19 is now an additional sort of stressor on that. So I think, there are many different concerns. I think particularly, my passion in many ways is thinking about people of African descent, because I think one, it's my experience, but also I think many of the problems that need to be solved for the humanity at a global scale, if we can solve them within our community, we kind of fix it for everyone else. And so we kind of, if you look at any situation, any system, the solution and the evolution always comes from the oppressed, right? And so we kind of have that responsibility almost to fix these problems. We are the oppressed. We are the ones that, you know, can have the solutions. And so, but when we look at the stressors that we're facing, we're getting it, you know, from all sides, environmentally, COVID-19, the inequities within the healthcare system, and then this being all happening in this undercurrent of racial trauma that's now being reignited in a way that, you know, we haven't seen, but that still is super impactful, even for people who weren't around to experience those initial, you know, those initial insults.
Yeah, and you mentioned something really interesting about how people are coming up and they're seeing they've grown up in the Obama presidency and now they're seeing the Trump presidency. They're reaching their political maturity, I guess you could call it. And over the last couple of years, especially on January 6th, a couple of weeks ago, there have been a lot of strong images in the media that might cause feelings of like fear and anxiety. How should people, specifically young people, be dealing with these feelings of trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be really mindful of the stimuli that we let into our minds and to our brains, right? I think there's one thing to be aware of what's happening in society. And I think there's this fine line that we have to toe as Black people in terms of like being aware of what's going on and not emotionally distancing ourselves from it so that we become, you know, apathetic and cold to the realities of what's going on. But we also can't inundate ourselves with the same things. Like, yes, another Black person was killed by the police. Yes, we understand this. This is something that has been happening. It is continuing to happen. And maybe viewing the exact specific, you know, way in which this particular person was killed doesn't necessarily benefit me. It doesn't necessarily add any information to help me solve the problem. And so I think being first mindful about what media we allow in and why, right? Again, I think part of how we get trapped in these cycles is by using some of these fear cues to keep us trapped in this sort of traumatic space that isn't a creative space, isn't a space in which you're actually tapping into the sort of power that is transformational, the type of power that we need to have in order to address the problems that we have. And so I think being mindful about you know what media you're accessing and why, right? If it's not going to build you up, if it's not going to motivate you to make a change, then maybe it's not something that you need to see. Maybe it doesn't really add anything valuable to. So question that, I think, and question the motivation behind the things that are being shown to you. I think, you know, having a network of people in which you can debrief, you know, I think sometimes we're most traumatized when there's no outlet, when we feel like we're the only person that's feeling this way. Particularly if you are existing in a predominantly white space where there might not be the kind of support to really be able to deal with those emotions on a daily basis, or having to go, you know, to work or go to class where these larger issues are being ignored. And so I think having that circle of people that you can sort of debrief and being intentional about those things and check in with yourself. You know, I think a lot of times we are taught, especially, you know, me coming from a Caribbean background, it's sort of like you kind of do what needs to be done. And sometimes emotions are just really not the key thing, right? Like you need to just ignore your emotions to do what needs to be done. And there was a certain space, I think, for our parents' generations and generations before that, in which like survival was the thing at play. And in some ways it still is, but we have to start transitioning from survival mode into a creative space. And so checking in with your emotions and seeing like, okay, how is this impacting me, and being aware of like the negative impact of things on you, I think can also be a really powerful way to make sure that you are having some control in terms of how you're navigating, you know, your spaces and the kind of media that you're seeing.
Thanks so much. Just want to make sure that everyone knows that you can ask questions in the chat below. So just make sure you ask a question, and we'll get to it very shortly. Dr. Alsop, my final question for you is that we just talked about people dealing with, you know, fear and anxiety and depression and all these other things. Do you have any messages of hope for young people who are dealing with these feelings at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think my My message of hope is, that I think is the same message as Jesus, which is like, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Like, you are a child of God, and that means something really, really powerful if you can tap into it, right? I think the young people are the ones with the solutions and are the ones that have to solve the problem. My generation, I'm 32. We're kind of on the cusp. Like, we'll do some things, but we're not going to get all the way there. And so the next generation really have to be the ones to solve this for humanity. And, it's written in the scriptures that they have the capacity to do that. And so I think, my message of hope is like, begin to really, the things that you hear in church and the messaging and all those things, like, begin to really tap into those things for your own self and understand what actually having a relationship with God is. Understand what it means to be in union with God. Understand what that power is, and sort of the creative potential that exists within that, and as a result exists within you, and really focusing more on that than the world and all the imagery that the world wants to show you. Focus instead on the kingdom and the imagery that it's trying to show, and like be a vessel for that instead of being sort of a circulator of everything that the media and the system wants to see continuing, in the community.
Thanks so much. I think my final question for you, and I said that was the last one, but this is actually the final question I really want to ask you, is we've seen what happened in these last 4 years. What is one word that you'd use to categorize these last 4 years of the last presidency?
America.
Well said. Thanks so much, Dr. Alsop. I really do appreciate it. We're moving on to the next segment, talking to Dr. Herman Percy, with difference in perspectives between the African American and the West and white perspectives. So, Dr. Percy, yeah, your time starts now.
Well, first, I would like to say thank you so much for organizing this very important discussion for such an important day, Martin Luther King Day. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I love the topic, the theme that we're using for this discussion, Road to Inauguration, because the road to inauguration has certainly been one that's been divisive. It's been one of social and civic unrest, political unrest. And I think it came to a head, really, January 6th. And for many of us onlookers that particular day as to what was going on Capitol Hill, I think a lot of people of faith, I was very confused. I was very confused to see, in the midst of all the riot, insurrection, domestic terrorism, in the midst of all that violence, I saw flags waving high and proud that said, Jesus saves. And one sign in particular, I took a picture of because I always want to keep that, to use it as a teachable moment. That sign said, "Hold the line, patriots. God wins." And so, like many, it left me scratching my head, trying to make sense of it all. And I realized that to make sense of it all, we really have to start with the Genesis. Because what we saw on January 6th is really the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. Now, the challenge with getting our people to see white supremacy is really about the narrow definition we've been using. For many, when you use the term white supremacy, it conjures up an image of bad men wearing hooded robes and burning crosses and using the N-word. But that's not the definition of white supremacy. That's an example of white supremacy. But the definition of white supremacy is the way in which a society organizes itself, what and whom it values or chooses to value, and the set of practices that inform the fundamental belief that one race is valued over another. Now, there's been a dizzying array of practices that defend that belief that there is one race that is valued over another. You know, you can go back to slavery days, for example, and maybe we should start there. You go back to slavery days. We know that the slaveholder would actually go to church and sit in the front pew while having his slaves sitting in the back pew. And then how about the theological teaching well into the 19th century that taught that Blacks are the descendants of Cain, who was physically marked for his sins, and modern day dark-skinned people carry the mark and inferior moral character. And then that was replaced by the scientific community in the 19th century, measuring our skulls to see our mental capabilities. When that didn't work, the psychological and political scientists came out with a book. Some of you may have heard about this book, The Bell Curve, in 1994, that argued that Blacks scored lower on standardized tests because we were not as intelligent. And that lack of intelligence was innate. So virtually every tool and discipline has been co-opted to justify white supremacists, from one argument replacing another and creeping into our culture and providing places for white supremacist arguments to take hold again and again. Unfortunately, too many Christians operate as if this theological world in which we have inherited is somehow isolated from culture and unshaped by culture, as if to say we are so isolated from the influences of the systemic way in which our society is organized, with who and what it values. Mm-hmm. And that powerful belief can be seen in the fact that it persists even in the face of glaring history, facts that are contrary to that. And the glaring evidence was demonstrated January 6th on our US Capitol. Much of what I am drawing from in my discussion today is really from a book written by, interestingly, a white researcher by the name of Robert P. Jones. He heads up a public opinion research firm here in Washington, D.C. And he has a book called White Too Long, White Too Long. He really uses that title from a work from James Baldwin. James Baldwin wrote that most white Christians have been white too long, that they have married too long to the lie that white supremacy lives on. And so Robert P. Jones draws on that title. And so he says in his research, he says that yes, outwardly, a lot of white evangelicals profess that they have shunned that whole idea of white supremacy, but according to his research, the historical legacy lives on. So I'll pause there as we continue our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Percy. I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about, because you mentioned white supremacy and how they've co-opted Christianity. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, you know, part of what I will say is that, so going back to January 6th and that march on the Capitol, well, I shouldn't say a march, that riot on the Capitol. Did you notice that the age range of most of the rioters? You didn't see a lot of Gen Zs in that crowd. You didn't see a lot of millennials in that crowd. In fact, for the Black Lives Matter movement, you find more Gen Zs and you find more millennials making up that crowd. Yeah. It has to do with an old system that's dying and a new system that's trying to rebirth. And there's an importance in this moment that I don't want us to miss, that really speaks to what is going on, to your question. In the history of this nation, there are times when their significance marked by great moments of economic, cultural, and demographic shifts all happening at the same time. We are in that moment right now. We are actually living in a moment where an old order is being shifted and a new order is replacing it. In the last few decades, there has been a demographic and cultural shift in our nation. The US Census Bureau actually has a report out that says that by 2043, America will have a majority of non-whites. In fact, the last year white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the majority was in 1993. And Pew Research actually also shows something that's also very significant to our conversation. Pew Research shows that the fastest growing religious body is not Christianity, it's Islam. Yeah. So when Trump, under Obama's leadership, said that, hey, quote, we have a problem in this country and it's called Muslims. And by the way, our president is not one. It was a dog whistle to white supremacy in this country. And did you know that even by the end of President Obama's second term, CNN and ORC did a poll, and it actually found that 53% of Trump supporters still believe that Obama was a Muslim. And all Republicans surveyed, even though they didn't support Trump, 43% of them believed at the end of Obama's second term that he was a Muslim. So Trump, through all his presidency, he was able to sustain the support of white evangelicals. And he did that by activating that white supremacy argument. He didn't talk about, he did talk about the economy, but it was really that dog whistle that he was able to use to evoke fears of this changing demographic that we see going on in this country, which brings along a cultural shift. And so I love if you read just periodicals, just turn to your average newspaper, New York Times, online, Huffington Post, the Atlantic, they talk about who are the Trump voters. And that really gives you the mindset of what's going on, why whites are seeing things differently from Blacks. When Trump first took office, a lot of researchers were saying that, his supporters are those who live in rural counties, they're poor. Hillary called them a basket of deplorables. But political scientists, we have been consistent in showing that it has nothing to do with education. It has nothing to do with their income. In fact, a lot of the rioters January 6th were business leaders and CEOs. Some flew in private jets. They stayed in 4-star hotels. His supporters are not just those in the rural areas. We find that the commonality with the rural supporters and the supporters who are of great or strong enough social economic status, the common ground that we find is the race factor. It is the white supremacy. Matter of fact, the Pew Research also did another survey, and the interesting thing that they found, and what's going on in the mindset, they surveyed white Americans and asked how they felt about the future. About most of them, about 68% to be exact, felt that things were getting worse, and they weren't confident about the future for their children. They felt that things were better off 50 years ago. The same survey, however, found that Blacks were more optimistic about the future and less nostalgic about the past. This is what political scientists are calling the nostalgia voters. What's going on is you find that there are some whites, when they look back in the past, they look back to a time when there was less protests, more benefits for them. And so when they look to the future, they're seeing the strong cultural and demographic shift where they are no longer the ones in power. And so a president like President Trump, who has that dog whistle to say, I will give you your country back. Let's make America great again. It sends that dog whistle, that wink and nod, that we have to take our country back and return to the good old days.
Absolutely. I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question or comment, go ahead and leave it in the chat and we'll get to it as soon as possible. Dr. Percy, we've talked a lot about race. Could you just show us the differences that people of color and white people saw, the differences that they saw when they were looking at the riots at the Capitol? What were some of the differences that they saw?
Well, I appreciate President-elect Joe Biden's speech immediately after the riots, when he said it was so obvious how those rioters were treated than how Black Lives Matter protesters, peaceful protesters, were treated. Police are aggressive with social justice protesters than they are with right wingers. They treat them with kids' gloves. There's an organization called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. They have been doing studies about how police actually treat protesters. Interestingly, they have found that police were twice as likely to break up left-wing protests and use aggressive force against leftists more than right-wingers. So they found that 51% of the times police were aggressive with left-wingers, social justice protesters, and only 34% of the time that they were aggressive with those who march for causes dealing with Republican platform. You know what's very interesting, just taking a look at history. In 1971, here's an interesting fact. In 1971, the anti-Vietnam War protests that took place, President Nixon at that time sent about 12,000 military troops to add to an already sizable national troop and police force. And over the past few days, I don't know for you, but when I hear the FBI and other officials talk about the minimal amount of people who have been arrested so far with the riots, I think back to this anti-Vietnam War protest, because in 3 days, they rounded up more than 12,000 protesters. They didn't even have anywhere to detain them. They just put them all in the RFK Stadium here in Washington, D.C. In 3 days, they rounded up more than 12,000 protesters. Yet today, you're telling me you can only round up a few hundreds and it's been more than a week? It speaks to what this organization has found in its research on how law enforcement goes after right-wing protesters. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that more than answers my question. I want to end on asking you the same question I asked Dr. Alsop. We've seen what's been going on in these last 4 years in politics. What's the one word you would use to categorize these last 4 years?
Divisive. Absolutely. And that is why President-elect Joe Biden has said that he is going to unify this country. You know, and when you really think about it, we certainly can expect more protests, right? Because for Trump supporters, the ones who, and believe me, I'm not saying that 100% of Trump supporters are all white supremacists, okay? That's not what I'm saying at all. But for those supporters who are white supremacists, you can only imagine that according to research that shows that white hate groups increased under Trump, jumped by 30%, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. You can only imagine how angry they are because it said that Trump got in office because we had a Black president. So you can only imagine how angry they are that before Trump and after Trump, there will be a Black person in the White House. I don't want us to miss that fact of the irony of it all, but it really speaks to that demographic and cultural shift that we are seeing in this nation. So to your question, it's been divisive, but with this new presidential team of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, we will be working towards unity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Percy. We're going to be moving on to Attorney Lillian Shepherd. I heard you had some remarks. The clock starts now for you.
Good evening. I am honored to be considered to be among the panelists that have spoken before me, and I am in absolute awe of them. I think I was watching a TV show once that says, "A lie doesn't care who tells it." And the best way to describe the Trump presidency is that it started with a lie and it's ending with a lie. And to piggyback off of what Dr. Percy just said, my observation has always been that America, when President Obama became president, Mitch McConnell made the determination that he was going to make him a one-term president, and that didn't happen. But that segment of the country, of America, I think was so devastated that he was successful, even when they tied his hands. And for me, the observation that I came to when we ended up with Trump is that America would rather fail with a white man than thrive with a Black man. And it is amazing to me that with all that has happened, with the lies that he has told, with the COVID-19 situation, that we still had 74 million people vote for Trump. And I think I'm harking back to the fact that I don't believe that those 74 million people really voted for him. That not all 74 million voted for him because they are with his ideology, but a majority of them probably voted for him because they didn't want the Black woman coming along. So we're always, no matter how successful Black people are and trying to do right by America, America will always try to do wrong by us. Like I said, Trump presidency started with a lie, and his base and his enablers, I've always said, my problem was no longer with Trump. My problem was with Congress, because they knew better, but yet they accepted him and all the foolishness that came with him. Trump, when he won, the Electoral College was 306 to 232. And his speech was, it was a landslide. It's never been done before. No one corrected him, or they were afraid to correct him, because Obama was 365 to 173 in 2008, and he was 332 to 206. And the last time I checked, those numbers were all higher than Trump's number. So where's the landslide that never happened before? I think what I did, coming from Guyana and having to learn the United States, I think one of the things, the time that I started to pay attention to the elections was with Obama, because he was on the verge of doing something historical. And I think it's the first time I actually looked at the states. I learned which is a red state, which is a blue state, and what state I was in. And I think a lot of Americans don't look at the map. Election night, I have a chat with my nieces, and one of them was stressing at 8 o'clock. And I'm like, why are you stressing at 8 o'clock? And she's like, because Trump is ahead. Well, what states is he ahead in? Well, she gives me, Kentucky, Indiana. He's supposed to be ahead in those states. Those states are red states. And then she's stressing about Texas. Why are you stressing about Texas? Texas is red. Stop looking at it. So I think for young people coming along, you need to look at the states and know what you're up against, where you're monitoring. I told them that night before I went to bed that stop looking at the country, look at 3 states. He needed to keep, President-elect Biden and Harris needed to keep the states that Hillary won in 2016, and he needed to reclaim Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I went to bed. I woke up the next day, I refused to look at anything. And then about noon, I'm going, wait a minute, what's going on? Why haven't we heard anything? And then I saw how close it was. So then we come to the new lie, the ending lie, which is the election was stolen. And I think this is another place where people fail to use common sense. Common sense is definitely not common anymore. So Cruz and Graham and Hawley and the 3 other senators who are part of the election was stolen. I'm trying to understand, and I say it unapologetically, if the Democrats were going to steal the election, they did a piss poor job because they needed to get Graham's seat. They needed to get McConnell's seat. And the starkest example of how foolish this lie is, you flipped Georgia blue. So you took the time to steal the presidency for Georgia, but you didn't bother to secure the senators down ballot. You forced them into a runoff. And it's like nobody bothers to process that. So when I look at the insurrectionists on Wednesday, and I'm watching the TV because I'm watching them certify the votes, and I see these people enter into the Capitol, at that moment in time for me, I was not a Democrat or a Republican, I was an American, and you were violating the sanctity for our institution. And yet, even with that mob, people can't come down on the side of it is 100% wrong. They're still parsing it. Oh, well, it's Antifa, and then it's the left wingers. Well, my biggest concern is tomorrow and whether or not Trump will pardon any of them. So I'm hoping the lie that is Antifa perpetuates, because then you can't pardon the Antifas. So I need that lie. This is one time I need that lie to go forward and hold tight. So from a legal standpoint now, you're looking at the impeachment. Well, I equate it to, impeachment process is completely for Congress. It's nowhere else. So the House of Representatives has voted to impeach him. I equate that to the state indicting someone for committing a crime. So he's been indicted. Now it has to go to the Senate for them to conduct a trial. Of course, his supporters and enablers are saying, well, he's no longer going to be president, so why not just toss it out and not go forward? To that I say, when we indict someone for a criminal action and they flee the state or they flee the country, we don't toss out the indictment. We hold it until they come back. And or you try them in absentia. So the same thing can happen to Donald Trump. When the House sends it over to the Senate, they should still go forward with the trial, and prayerfully, they can find 17 or more Republican senators to say, this was an attack on our House. It doesn't matter how it happened. It was his words that caused these people to come here, and that they will find him guilty of it. And with that, strip him of all the benefits that he would receive post-president. I guess that's my starting point.
Thank you so much, Attorney Shepherd. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got here. You know, a decade ago, then President Obama was running for his second term. I was just about to graduate 8th grade. And now, you know, we get to the point where people are storming the Capitol. American citizens are actually storming the Capitol. How do we get here? What events do you think led us to this point, and how can we recover?
I think we got here the same, piggybacking off of what Dr. Percy said. We got here because the old guard is becoming the minority, and they don't like that. You know, Trump started off with his message that Mexico was sending us their rapists and their murderers. But what he failed to tell the people is that he was hiring the best that Mexico sent to clean his hotels and his golf courses. So people are worried about the Mexicans coming to take their jobs. Well, what job did you have that the Mexican is coming to take? I remembered I ran races all over this country. And I went to Ennis, Montana in 2016, myself and another runner, 2 Black women in Ennis, Montana, one of the whitest states I've ever been in. The population of Ennis, Montana is probably less than 1,000 people. And we went to get dinner and the waitress was Black. So I said, okay, how'd you get here? And she tells us she's from Jamaica. Oh, well, now you really got to tell me how you got here. Ennis, Montana doesn't have a subway, it doesn't have a bus system, it's not a metropolis, so it's not easy to move around, it's cold. So she told us, oh, you know, I have a friend who worked here and they needed help. And so she told me about it and I came from Jamaica here. And then the housekeeper at the hotel, and it sort of looked like the Bates Motel from back in the gold rush days, she was Jamaican. And I'm trying to figure out how 2 Black people from Jamaica are in Ennis, Montana. If white people are worried about us taking their jobs, how did they get here? You don't want to do those jobs. You don't want to do the menial labor, so you have to import it. But then you're mad that they're here and you want to say we're taking your jobs in Ennis, Montana. So I was just like completely dumbfounded. Like I here's a Guyanese and I'm stumbling upon Jamaicans. So how did we get here? White people are becoming the minority and they don't like it. And their only way is to attack us. But we keep, you know, we keep rising and we keep flourishing and we keep disproving them. But they're gonna try to keep pushing us down for as long as they can. So Obama came in, he was successful. He didn't push the envelope too much. He could have, he didn't. But, you know, I think they just can't see that happen again. And I promise you this, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure Kamala Harris does not become president.
And that's very interesting. I want to open it up to the other panelists. Dr. Alsop, we've seen a rising amount of tension in the last decade. Where do you think that's coming from?
I mean, I think similarly to what we've heard, like this cycle, you know, happens repeatedly, right? Like we see it happening in the 60s, it's happening before that, you know, in the 20s. And so, like I said, every few decades we come to this head. And so it is a cycle, it's a cycle, but it's a progressive cycle. And that each time the barrier is a little bit, you know, it's little bit lower. The extent to which we're pushing the boundaries of society, you know, are a little bit further. And so, you know, as we know, just by the data, by the demographics, the country is going to change. You know, we see who is making the demographic of the Republican Party, especially the far right. We see the demographic of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Democratic Party. And I think the reason why we're seeing this this sort of increased tension is because of that fear, you know, and it's always been this innate fear, I think, subconsciously in people of European descent, particularly in America, that if Black people or anybody else gets power in this country, that we will essentially, you know, treat them the way that they've treated us. And so they have to really fight for what they believe is theirs, right? Like if I'm this person who is valuing this legacy of white supremacy that I've inherited, I see that crumbling before me, and that's really scary. And I have to resort to the tactics that I've been taught is the same tactics the Ku Klux Klan used, the same tactics the police use, same tactic the FBI has used. And so I think that really is it. It's people looking at the social dynamic, realizing that it is changing, it is going to change, and it's sort of the last sort of futile attempt at stopping what is inevitable in terms of just the progress of the sociocultural norms in this country.
Well said. Dr. Percy, anything to add?
Well, you know, I was thinking that I don't want to repeat myself, but certainly it's important to just emphasize that indeed we find that there's a diversity of citizenry. And so with that comes certain changes in communities and certainly in leadership. And going back to Robert P. Jones' book on White Too Long, and he, in his survey, he asked white evangelicals with this change in cultural shift, how do they think that they will respond to that? And that's what he was talking about in his book, that though white evangelicals, and again, not all, but though you find that within that group that they will openly say that they don't support white supremacy, he's saying that in the survey, asking that question, that you could see the legacy of the history of white supremacy. And so certainly, as I talked about earlier, that the old order struggling with the new order, because there is a fear, and political science researchers and social scientists, they call it the white anxiety theory, which Trump used to stroke fears even further, that they will now lose power. You find that in our history, there was a collusion between the media and political influences and religious leaders and even the police to maintain a certain order. And primarily white made up of the leadership in all those areas. But with the demographic shift and the cultural shift, we're finding more minorities represented in those particular segments of our society. And so there's a white anxiety that we see, and that's what Trump used to help wave him in the White House, but now we've ushered him out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Percy. Attorney Shepherd, we have a question that came in. It's hard to be fearful of another uprising in this country after January 6th. How possible is it that one could happen? Do you have any comments on that?
I think the only thing that may quell another uprising is the fact that a lot of the insurrectionists are the ones who were emboldened to march on the Capitol under their president's order. I think those of us looking on are now seeing that it comes with consequences. And as Dr. Percy pointed out, that Trump's supporters are not just the rural people and the uneducated people. They are your doctors and your lawyers and your police officers and your military personnel and your neighbors and your coworkers. And now they're also experiencing the consequences of that and losing jobs. So folks may want to try it, but if they have something to lose, they may give it pause. And I think, Lindsey Graham is talking about unity. Well, one way for us to get unity is for Lindsey Graham to come out and say that he lied, that the election was stolen. And until he and the others do that, we're always going to be uncomfortable. At least I will be.
Can I also weigh in on that question?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Because to the question of whether or not they'll have riots again by white supremacists, I would say that I believe that it will happen again, because you find that right now we have great military presence and law enforcement presence in our federal capital, right? But we've been hearing news reports the past few days that white supremacists and the rioters are planning to attack all 50 state capitals. And we know that we don't have strong law enforcement presence in all 50 state capitals. Most of the law enforcement presence is at the Capitol. There's a good example of these rioters storming into the governor's mansion or house in Michigan, right? A few months ago, and nothing really happened to them. So I think that they'll try it again. I talked earlier about how few people we've seen rounded up so far, when back in 1970s, we found that in 3 days, they were able to arrest far more people. And so I think that even for the next few days, you might see a bit of quietness, that we shouldn't let our guards down, because power doesn't give up without a fight, right? We know that. And so, as I said, those who are fearful of a Black person in office before Trump and after Trump, they will plan to strike again. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll be successful, but certainly we can expect to see protests and riots again.
Well said. Attorney Shepherd, I have a couple more questions for you. We're talking more about impeachment now. The House just passed the articles of impeachment last week. What good would that do if Trump's already leaving office? And do you believe he'll be convicted?
My instinct tells me he won't be, because the Republicans are entrenched on their position, and they can't admit that he lied and they lied. However, if they have well, let me go back. One of the reasons I don't think they'll convict him, is because they still want that racist base. They still want those white supremacists to like them. So they can't say that Trump started this or Trump encouraged this. So I'm hard pressed to find 17 Republican senators who will do it. The beautiful thing that would have happened if they were to find the courage to do it, is that once, because it's 2/3 of the Senate that has to convict him. Once they did that, then they only need a majority to strip him of all of his benefits, so that he doesn't get his salary anymore for the rest of his life. He doesn't get protection. His children don't get protection. So those are the pluses. Now, if the Republican Party really wanted to get rid of Trump, because in the beginning, if you remember, Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, who I actually like to call him by his rightful name, which is Rafael Eduardo Cruz, they were all calling him a pathological liar. Well, I don't know too many pathological liars who just reform. I assume they have to get treatment. And I don't recall at any point in time Trump getting treatment, but all of a sudden they're licking his boots and now, promoting Trump, and President Trump is the greatest thing since sliced bread. However, if they really wanted to get rid of him for whatever hold he has on them, this would be the opportunity to do it. Convict him, strip him, and then he can't run in 2024. And you don't have to worry about him in the field anymore for 2024. The problem is you still have the stink of him on you. So I'm not quite sure how you're going to work that part out. But I am not optimistic that he would be convicted.
Thanks so much, Attorney Shepherd. I have one more question for you. This is the last question, and then we'll wrap up. I asked this question to everyone else. We've seen what happened in the last 4 years, all the divisiveness. What's the one word you'd use to categorize the last 4 years in politics?
Destructive.
Destructive. So we had America, divisive and destructive. Okay, Pastor Smith, do you have any words of hope to end this out on? And then we could close this up.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you all for taking the time to share your wisdom from the areas of influence that each and every one of you have. I would suggest that each of you go online and order the book that Dr. Percy has written. Dr. Percy, I was about to say it's right over your shoulder. Yes, ma'am. Can you go ahead and before we kind of give closing remarks, give us some insight on that book just a little bit for persons who should be buying it?
You know, the book is about, it's Will Your Vote Count? And the subtitle is Fixing America's Broken Electoral System. And I wrote that back about a few years ago, actually, and I was looking primarily at the 2000 presidential election debacle, and then looking at 2004 and 2008 election, and taking a look at how there are some voting irregularities and disenfranchisement of African Americans. The interesting thing, though, that I have to point out is in Trump's lawsuits about this present election, something I want African Americans to note, that in my research in doing this book and taking a look at how Blacks have always had problems in voting, every election we have problems in voting, but there are some states where this voting problem persists. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. Those are the states that President Trump has used to exploit us in his so-called fight to say that he's questioning election integrity. Because he knows that in these particular states and particular cities, African Americans, we've always had problems. Yet notice he's never, or anyone on his team has ever pursued fighting for us, right? So in 2000, Al Gore and Democrats tried to restore our votes, but nothing became of it. So it's very interesting to see Trump and Rudy Giuliani using our cities. Notice in Michigan, he's fighting that there was a question of election integrity in Detroit. In Pennsylvania, questioning election integrity in Philadelphia. Primarily places where we have a majority Black population. I've heard some scientists argue this point. It's not my point, but I've heard it argued that perhaps what he's suggesting is that Blacks shouldn't really have a right to vote, that we should not be participating as much in the political process like the good old days, right? And so it's interesting, and I think my book will help to also bring healing and unity, because again, it talks about how to fix our broken electoral system.
Thank you so much. I think that is very important that we study and understand things about voting and the electoral process. Attorney Shepherd really dug into it when you were giving the example of your niece and like, why are you concerning yourself with Texas? Why are you concerning yourself with the states that we need or that we know to be red? Like, you need to look at other stuff. You know, I think that it's important that we study and understand these things when we're not in an election moment, just on a normal day outside of election time, so that when we're building up towards that moment, we already have the understanding within us about managing our expectations with certain things, understanding what things really mean and what they look like, and how we can help other people understand what the whole process is. We can't wait till the last hour to really get everything together. So a book like this is something that I would strongly promote. I know that Attorney Shepherd can be contacted on Facebook, and I'm sure she would be more than happy to dive in further with persons and to continue to explain her knowledge on just the whole system and her viewpoint on it. Just Attorney Shepherd, is that correct? Facebook will be fine?
Yes.
Wonderful. And you can search her name in order to find her on Facebook and, you know, get into discussions with her about what is happening. She is right there right there working in the thick of things and has a wealth of knowledge. And we thank you so much. Dr. AZA is on Instagram and he deals with mindfulness. And in this world that we're living in, whether it's dealing with the political unrest or it is dealing with COVID-19, I think we all need a moment to learn how to process and how to have a cool down, if you will. And AZA is very deep into just mindfulness, just bringing yourself into order. He spoke a lot about your relationship with God and your oneness with God, and then using those things to not be circular, not to be in the cycle of the world, but to really bring yourself into order. And so if you follow him on Instagram, can you please tell us your proper handle, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pastor Smith. It's AZA, the messenger. Just the letters AZA and then the messenger on Instagram.
Thank you so much. And so the three panelists that we've had been amazing, and we thank you. And the last thing I'd like us to look at is the hope. What is the hope in everything that we've spoken about? One of the things that come to my mind is I am hopeful in the proactive nature that Biden and Harris have had thus far. I'm hopeful in it. In a moment where Biden could have waited perhaps to do some transitioning, it was needful that he stepped in quickly because COVID-19 is still here. And so he started to step in and to do things as much as he could that our president should have been doing when he was hiding or tantruming or doing whatever he was doing, wherever he was doing it. Biden did some proactive measures to step in and try as much as he could to get things rolling. Where is the hope? The hope that I am seeing deals with the diversity in the cabinets that Biden is establishing. If anybody Googles it, you'll start to see that you have men and women who are Black and white and anybody precious in God's sight. Come on now, somebody. You're seeing people put into offices who are qualified because of their brain and their experience as opposed to their skin color. When I look at what he's establishing, it makes me very hopeful. You have people who are of various backgrounds, and that makes me excited, not only because it looks different, but now it really represents what America is. America is a melting pot of everything and everybody. And so that brings me a lot of hope. And so we talked about so many things today that have brought so much perspective and insight as to how we got there. It gave us some understanding as to how to deal with Generation Z and understand what Generation Z is really going through when they're seeing images like a noose hanging across in the view of the Capitol. It's 2021, that's not normal. And so to see how Generation Z may process that as horrible and as something hard to deal with, we're seeing that there is hope in what Biden, by God's grace, is establishing. And so if anybody else would like to speak to that as a closing remark of hope, what are the hopeful moments that you are seeing as we take this road towards inauguration?
I'll just jump in. There's a quote from Martin Luther King that I would share. I too agree with you, Pastor, that the cabinet, the diversity of the cabinet is really hopeful. And I'm reminded of the text in Psalms that put not our trust, however, in princes or in man or in chariots, but put our trust and our hope in Christ. And to that Martin Luther King quote, since it is Martin Luther King Day, and I've been thinking about this quote actually all day. Martin Luther King said, "Morality cannot be legislated, but we could put laws in place to restrain the heartless." And much of what we've been seeing has been heartless. And we have a new administration that will put in regulations and laws to restrain the heartless.
I think for me, the MLK quote that I've looked at all day, I'm not sure if it gives hope or it's just showing me my reality, but it's nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And I think that is what we've been dealing with a lot for the last 4 years. I myself, with the Biden administration coming in, at first, my first thought was, I need them to appoint some Gen Zs, because we are never going to be able to move forward if we keep the old guards in place, whether they're great or not. But then when I started to see that he was appointing what I'll call the old heads, I paused and I relaxed for a second, because I came to the realization that we are in such a hot mess that we need the experienced hands on deck. And we don't need anybody with a learning curve now. So I took comfort in the fact that he was putting people in place with subject matter expertise. In my opinion, Trump meant no good for the America, because when you appointed the most glaring, ridiculous appointment of Dr. Carson at HUD, it was the one time I realized that I qualified for a position in the Trump administration. And I should have been able to get it, because I didn't need to know what the job was that I was doing. So I am taking comfort in the people that President-elect, and I can't wait to say just President Biden on Wednesday and Vice President Harris on Wednesday, that they're putting people in place who have the knowledge base, who have the experience. And I am hopeful that they will put some Gen Z behind them in their deputy positions and their associate positions, so that you have a continuity of service and you have an ability to replace the old heads with the young ones, and we can keep this country moving forward. So that's where my hope and comfort is coming from.
It's like a healthy passing of the baton.
Correct.
You know, which I'm an advocate for 110%, a healthy passing of the baton.
Correct.
Thank you. Dr. Alsop, did you have?
I would say, so I'll also quote Brother King, shout out to Alpha Phi Alpha. He says that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's a very true statement. And I think the Bible also tells the same story. And so that's kind of where I place my hope.
I thank God for that. I thank God for each and every one of you. And I'm grateful that we know that whichever way we swing it, our hope is in God, which is why in our prayers, we have to pray for Biden and Harris and those that they have put together. We have to pray their wisdom, their humility, their strength, everything, their family. I believe that that's our job for sure, to pray for them, their wisdom, and that they are led by God every day, that they are led by God. My hope begins right there, that they are led by God. And then all of the things that each and every one of us touched on the last few minutes, dealing with the diversity and everything else. It is refreshing to see, but I just pray that the wisdom that they need, that's what carries them through daily by the hand of God. And so listen, I would like to thank each and every one of you, Mr. Richard Cunningham, for your eloquence and how you moderated this entire session. For Dr. Azier Alsop, we appreciate your wisdom in psychiatry and wellness and mindfulness. Attorney Shepard, for your realness in how you convey the truth of the matter when it comes to political issues and how we got somewhere and what really is before us. And Dr. Percy, we thank you so much just for the historical background that you give, for the intelligence that you provide on multiple areas. Each and every person, the three of you, if we continued on, we'd probably be here for a long time, just diving into so many areas, because the three of you could speak to all of these areas so knowledgeably. And I thank you so very much. There are books that the viewers need to get. Viewers, I'd like to thank you so much for viewing and for engaging the chat just with thoughts and questions. And I would definitely encourage you to reach out to Attorney Shepherd just to continue to get the realness and the truth of the matter, to get the book that Dr. Percy has spoken about. I definitely recommend that, as well as tapping into AZA and his mindfulness techniques. So everyone, God bless you. We're going to close with prayer, and we wish you Godspeed. Shall we pray? A loving Lord, we thank you so much. For tonight, we were able to receive the wisdom from your servants, dear Lord, and we thank you for what they have provided. Father, our hope ultimately is in you. And because that is the case, we ask, dear Lord, that you would provide justice and that you would do it through the election of Biden and Harris. Dear God, we lift them up. We ask, Holy Father, that you would provide for them the wisdom, the godliness, God, the good judgment, that you would open their eyes, dear Lord, and help them to do what is right. I ask, Heavenly Father, that you would protect them from the top of their head to the sole of their feet, dear Lord. Let no harm come upon them. Father, I pray that they would be able to bring together some morale in this place. I ask, dear Lord, that you would help them put together the economy, Father, so people who have lost jobs, God, may reclaim. And dear Lord, when it comes to COVID-19, dear Lord, you have the answer, and I pray you would give it to them. Father, help us, dear Lord, to encourage one another, to give hope, to help us to stand strong, dear Lord, and just to help us to be in unity. Help us to speak truth. Help us, God, to not ignore things. Help us to be honest with how we feel. Help us, dear God, to educate ourselves and to learn, dear Lord, so that we understand the times that are taking place, dear Lord. Not just the times politically, Father, but what is the Bible saying about these things? Help us, God, to dive into your word and to study so we may also understand. Father God, thank you once again. Bless each panelist. Bless our moderator in the name of Jesus. Amen.
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 God bless each and every one of you, from our panelists to our hosts to all of our viewers. From Metropolitan, we say thank you. God bless you. Good night.